In the shadowed world of espionage, where loyalty is a currency and betrayal a death sentence, one man would become both a hero and a traitor, depending on which side of the Iron Curtain you stood. His name, Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB colonel who became Britain's most valuable double agent. This is not a tale of fantasy, nor a Hollywood spy thriller. It is a true story, a story of courage, deception, and the perilous dance between two world powers during the Cold War. Between East and West, between truth and lies, stood one man, armed only with conviction, intellect, and an unshakable belief in freedom. For decades, the KGB, the Soviet Union's most feared intelligence agency, ruled through secrecy and terror. Its agents spied on friends, neighbors, and enemies alike, and within that system of suspicion, Oleg Gordievsky rose to power, only to turn against it. His double life would change the course of the Cold War. His betrayal would shake the Kremlin to its core, and his escape from Moscow, one of the most daring in intelligence history, would become the stuff of legend. This is The Spy and the Traitor, the greatest espionage story of the Cold War. Chapter 1. Moscow, 1938. A spy is born. Moscow, 1938. The Soviet Union stood firm under the iron rule of Joseph Stalin. Fear was law, and loyalty was survival. In a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, a child was born into a world of shadows, Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky. His father, Anton Gordievsky, was a loyal officer of the NKVD, the predecessor of the KGB. He believed deeply in the Soviet system, in the mission to protect the motherland from her enemies. At home, his uniform hung proudly near the door, a symbol of both duty and danger. Oleg's childhood was shaped by whispers of arrests, disappearances, and fear. Yet to him, espionage was not evil. It was honorable. He grew up believing that the intelligence service was the heart of patriotism, that to serve the state was to serve truth itself. But as Oleg matured, the world around him began to change. By the 1950s, the iron grip of Stalin had loosened, slightly. The new Soviet leadership sought to balance power with diplomacy. Education was prized, ideology was refined, and the young Oleg, bright and inquisitive, excelled. He studied history and politics at Moscow State University, a breeding ground for the next generation of Soviet elites. He absorbed Marx and Lenin, the principles of communism, and the mythology of the revolution. But deep down, a spark of curiosity grew, a fascination with the outside world. Western music, literature, and films quietly slipped into his awareness, and with them, an unsettling question. What if the truth about the West was different from what he'd been told? In 1962, Oleg Gordievsky joined the KGB, the formidable successor to the NKVD. To his father, this was the ultimate honor. To Oleg, it was destiny. The KGB was more than an intelligence agency. It was a religion. Its officers were priests of secrecy, bound by oath, trained to manipulate, recruit, and control. For years, Oleg believed in the mission. He worked diligently, studying spycraft, learning surveillance, recruitment, and counterintelligence techniques. Yet the more he saw, the more he began to doubt. The Soviet Union portrayed itself as the champion of equality and progress. But behind the walls of the KGB, Oleg witnessed corruption, lies, and brutality. Officers fabricated intelligence, innocent people were accused, and loyalty, once the highest virtue, became a weapon used to destroy lives. Oleg began to feel the first cracks in his faith. One day, as he walked past a public square, he saw a group of young citizens being arrested for reading Western literature. The image haunted him, not because they were enemies of the state, but because they were just curious minds, punished for asking questions. That was the moment the seed of doubt was planted. As he rose through the ranks, Oleg was assigned to the KGB's Department of Cultural Relations, a front for espionage operations abroad. His job was to observe diplomats, academics, and travelers to identify potential threats or recruits. But Oleg saw it differently. Every new encounter with foreigners, every conversation with Westerners, opened a small window to another world, a freer, more open society. And it was through that window that he began to see the truth. He realized that the West was not the monstrous enemy the Soviet Union had painted. Instead, it was a world where people could speak their minds without fear. The disillusionment grew quietly but steadily, the kind that transforms not overnight, but over years of silent observation. By the late 1960s, Oleg Gordievsky had become a trusted KGB officer, but within him lived two versions of the same man, the loyal Soviet spy and the silent skeptic. This inner conflict would soon lead him to a decision that would forever change the history of espionage and put his life in mortal danger, for the man trained to spy on the West was about to betray the East. Coming up next, in Chapter 2, The Making of a KGB Officer, we follow Oleg Gordievsky's rise within the Soviet intelligence service, his secret posting in Copenhagen, and the fateful moment he encounters Western intelligence for the first time. Stay tuned. As the web of espionage tightens and the world's greatest double agent begins his dangerous journey between two empires. By the late 1960s, Oleg Gordievsky had fully entered the hidden world of Soviet intelligence. The Cold War was at its height, a silent battlefield where spies, not soldiers, determined the fate of nations. The KGB, headquartered in the forbidding Lubyanka building in Moscow, was both respected and feared. Inside its gray walls, thousands of agents served the Soviet Empire, tracking enemies, fabricating propaganda, and keeping the population under a constant watch of paranoia. And among them was a young man with sharp intellect, flawless discipline, and an ambition to rise, Oleg Gordievsky. Oleg was posted to the First Chief Directorate, the branch responsible for foreign intelligence. There, he was trained in the dark arts of espionage, recruitment, surveillance, code work, and the psychological manipulation of human targets. He learned how to follow without being seen, how to read body language, how to create a believable lie, and how to destroy reputations through subtle disinformation. Every day began the same way: a gray dawn over Moscow, a silent metro ride, the daily oath of secrecy. The KGB taught that truth was a flexible weapon, and that to control people one must first control information. In training lectures, the instructors would point to maps of Europe, divided neatly into East and West, and remind the recruits, the enemy is everywhere. The West wants to destroy us. Every handshake hides a spy. For most trainees, this indoctrination worked, but for Oleg, the propaganda began to sound hollow. He had read the works of Western thinkers, glimpsed their culture through banned books, and quietly wondered, if the Soviet Union was truly superior, why were its citizens so afraid? In 1963, Oleg received his first significant assignment, a posting in East Berlin, the very front line of the Cold War. Berlin was the meeting point of two worlds, capitalist West and communist East, divided by a wall of concrete and ideology. For a KGB officer, it was paradise and hell. The city teemed with spies from every agency, the CIA, MI6, the Stasi, the Mossad. Everyone watched everyone else. Every conversation was a trap. Every friendship could be fatal. Oleg's job was to observe Western diplomats, identify potential recruits, and feed Moscow with reports on enemy activities. Yet, in Berlin, Oleg saw something he hadn't expected. He saw Western citizens crossing checkpoints freely, smiling, carrying cameras, talking without fear. He saw bookstores filled with ideas, ideas that the Soviet state had deemed dangerous, and in contrast, he saw the dull gray life of the East. Queues for food, constant surveillance, and people whispering even inside their homes. It was in Berlin that Oleg's inner transformation began to accelerate. He had been trained to hate the West, but what he saw with his own eyes told him another truth. After his service in East Berlin, Oleg was transferred back to Moscow for advanced training. His efficiency and intelligence had not gone unnoticed. He was now trusted with higher-level assignments, handling sensitive political information, even briefings about Western diplomatic strategies. But behind the polished surface of the KGB, Oleg sensed growing rot, corruption, power games, and moral decay. Officers competed for privileges, not patriotism. Truth was rewritten daily to please superiors. He began keeping a private journal, an act that could have cost him his life, where he quietly recorded his doubts about the Soviet regime. Then, in 1966, came the opportunity that would change everything. Oleg Gordievsky was posted to Copenhagen, Denmark, officially as a diplomat in the Soviet embassy's cultural section. In reality, he was a full-time intelligence officer tasked with gathering political, military, and social information from Danish and Western sources. Copenhagen was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was bright, open, and free. People spoke their minds without fear of surveillance. The contrast with Moscow was overwhelming. For the first time, Oleg could breathe. The Western world fascinated him. He began visiting art galleries, libraries, and concerts, all things considered frivolous in the Soviet mindset. He read Western newspapers and watched political debates. What astonished him was that criticism of leaders was allowed. In Moscow, such words would have meant prison. Here, it was democracy. And slowly, Oleg's admiration for the West evolved into conviction. The belief that the Soviet Union's system was not just flawed, but corrupt at its very core. The KGB expected him to cultivate agents, to spy on the Danish government, and to monitor NATO's activities. But Oleg found himself sympathizing more with the people he was meant to manipulate. He began feeding the KGB harmless information, small, unimportant details, while protecting his Western acquaintances from scrutiny. It was risky, but he was already walking a line between loyalty and rebellion, and soon the British intelligence service, MI6, would notice him. The encounter with the West. The year was 1974. Oleg Gordievsky had served several years in Denmark and had earned a reputation as one of the KGB's brightest young officers. But behind that confident smile, his ideological break with the Soviet regime was complete. He was ready to act. One evening, during a routine embassy event in Copenhagen, he met a British diplomat, friendly, polite, and disarmingly open. Their conversation was casual: art, politics, literature. But the diplomat was no ordinary man. He was an officer of MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service. The encounter would change Oleg's destiny forever. MI6 had been observing Oleg for months. They knew his intellectual curiosity, his disillusionment, his subtle defiance of Moscow's strict codes, but approaching a KGB officer was extremely dangerous. One wrong move, and both sides could end up dead. So they waited, patiently. They sent subtle signals, a compliment here, a shared interest there, testing whether he was open to communication. And Oleg responded. Not openly, not yet, but through gestures, tone, and curiosity, he let them know he was ready to talk. In intelligence circles, the recruitment of a KGB officer was a rare and priceless victory. But what MI6 saw in Oleg was something greater than opportunity. They saw conviction. Oleg didn't want money. He didn't want power or asylum. He wanted truth. He wanted to help the world understand the real nature of the Soviet regime, not for personal gain, but for moral justice. When he finally made contact with MI6, It was not an act of betrayal in his eyes, it was an act of liberation. From that day forward, Oleg Gordievsky became Britain's most valuable secret. Codenamed Sunbeam, he would rise within the KGB hierarchy, feeding information directly to MI6, revealing secrets of Soviet foreign policy and exposing spies operating in the West. But he knew the cost of being discovered. In Moscow, betrayal meant death. And as he continued his double life, he lived every day under the shadow of the executioner. For MI6, Oleg was a goldmine. He provided insights into Soviet diplomacy, KGB operations, and even Moscow's reaction to NATO strategies. His intelligence helped diffuse tensions that could have triggered nuclear confrontation. But as his value grew, so did the risk. Within the KGB, suspicion was a constant fog, and whispers of leaks began to circulate. Someone was betraying the Soviet Union, and soon the KGB would start hunting for the traitor within. Seeds of doubt and the dangerous game of deception. The Cold War was not fought with tanks or guns, it was fought with secrets. And for Oleg Gordievsky, every new secret he passed to the British was another step into the abyss. He knew the KGB's methods. He knew that when they suspected treachery, they didn't arrest immediately. They waited, watching, listening, tightening the net until escape was impossible. By the late 1970s, Oleg had become deputy resident in the Soviet embassy in Copenhagen, effectively the number 2 man in the KGB station there. Outwardly, he was the picture of loyalty, immaculate in his uniform, precise in his reports, efficient in his dealings with Moscow. But under that disciplined exterior, he was feeding MI6 a constant stream of priceless intelligence. Each report was photographed, coded, and transmitted through British diplomatic pouches or secret meetings in quiet Copenhagen parks. Sometimes he met his handlers in bookstores. Sometimes they left signals, a chalk mark on a lamppost, a folded newspaper on a bench. Every exchange carried the weight of life and death. MI6 understood the magnitude of what they had found. Oleg's intelligence revealed the inner mechanisms of Soviet foreign policy, the strategy of disinformation, the secret instructions guiding every ambassador, the methods of recruiting Western sympathizers. Through him, Britain began to understand not only what the Kremlin did, but why it did it. One of his early triumphs came when he exposed a covert Soviet campaign to undermine NATO unity through propaganda planted in European newspapers. Thanks to Oleg, the West learned how the USSR manipulated public opinion under the guise of peace movements. To MI6, he wasn't just a spy, he was a window into the soul of the KGB. But double lives exact a terrible toll. Oleg's marriage began to crumble under the strain. His wife, Layla, a fellow Soviet citizen, could sense something changing in him. Long absences, unexplained fatigue, a quiet melancholy. He could never tell her the truth. To protect her, he had to deceive her. Each morning he looked in the mirror and asked himself the same question: how long before they discover me? In 1980, Oleg was recalled to Moscow for a brief period, a move that filled him with dread. He knew the recall might be a test, or worse, a trap. The KGB routinely summoned officers back home to evaluate loyalty. In the gray interrogation rooms of the Lubyanka, subtle questions were weapons. What do you think of the West? Have you noticed disloyalty among your colleagues? Even hesitation could be fatal. Oleg answered flawlessly. He quoted Marx, praised the party, and concealed his inner terror. When they finally reassigned him abroad, he realized he had survived, for now. His next post was more prestigious, the KGB residency in London. For Oleg, it was both opportunity and danger multiplied. The Soviet Union considered London one of the most hostile capitals in the world, the very heart of Western intelligence. For MI6, it was a miracle. Their secret agent was now inside the Soviet station at the center of British intelligence activity. He would sit in embassy meetings by day, then slip coded notes to British handlers by night. Every piece of paper he handled, every cable he read, added another layer to Britain's understanding of Soviet operations across Europe. Among the most critical intelligence Oleg provided were details of a massive Soviet war plan, codenamed Ryan, a paranoid program to detect signs of a Western nuclear first strike. The Kremlin genuinely feared that NATO might launch a surprise attack, and Soviet forces were put on constant alert. Oleg's information convinced British and American leaders that the danger was real, that a misunderstanding could trigger nuclear war. His warnings helped the West tone down its rhetoric, easing a crisis that might otherwise have ended in catastrophe. For MI6 officers, debriefing Oleg was a delicate art. Meetings were brief, coded, and always in motion. Sometimes he'd board a train, step off at the last moment, then blend into the crowd while surveillance teams searched for him in vain. He memorized pages of documents rather than carry them. His memory became his weapon. He could recall every paragraph, every number, every directive. MI6 officers often left these meetings shaken, not only by the quality of the intelligence, but by Oleg's calm courage. He knew that discovery meant execution, yet he showed no fear. But the longer the double life continued, the heavier it became. Each coded message sent to MI6 deepened his guilt toward his family and his country. He was betraying the organization that had raised him, the system his father had devoted his life to. And yet, he believed he was serving a greater truth: preventing war, exposing tyranny, saving lives. The human heart of a spy is never black or white. It lives in endless shades of gray. In 1982, Oleg was promoted to resident, the top KGB officer in London, an extraordinary achievement. It was unprecedented that a man secretly working for Britain should lead the Soviet intelligence operations against Britain itself. From this position, Oleg continued to feed MI6 invaluable material: the names of Soviet agents, the networks of disinformation, the psychological profile of the Kremlin elite. He even briefed MI6 about how Moscow perceived Margaret Thatcher's government, intelligence that shaped diplomatic strategy in the most critical years of East-West tension. For British intelligence, Oleg became their greatest Cold War success. For the KGB, he was their most dangerous traitor, though they didn't yet know his name. But secrets never stay hidden forever. Somewhere in the shadows, another spy, working for Moscow inside the CIA, was watching. His name was Aldrich Ames, and in a few short years, Ames's betrayal of the West would lead straight to Oleg Gordievsky's door. Betrayal inside the KGB and the Great Escape from Moscow. By the early 1980s, Oleg Gordievsky had become one of MI6's most productive agents in history. His information shaped NATO's understanding of the Kremlin and helped the West navigate one of the most volatile phases of the Cold War. But in the invisible battlefield of espionage, triumph often breeds danger. And deep within the KGB, whispers of betrayal began to circulate. Somewhere, someone was giving the West secrets only Moscow's elite should know. And soon, those whispers found a name. In 1985, in a quiet corner of Langley, Virginia, a man walked into the Soviet embassy carrying a brown envelope. That man was Aldrich Ames, a mid-level CIA officer drowning in debt and resentment. Inside the envelope were the names of US and British assets working against the Soviet Union, including the KGB colonel who had become MI6's crown jewel. For $20,000 in cash, Ames sold the lives of men and women who had risked everything to spy for the West. Among the files he handed over was a clue, a pattern of intelligence leaks that pointed straight to London. The KGB's counterintelligence unit began to dig. Inside the Lubyanka, Investigators combed through every cable, every report from their foreign residencies. Gradually, the web narrowed toward a single name: Oleg Gordievsky. He had access to the very information that had reached London. He had been in the right place at the right time, and his behavior, though careful, had occasionally drawn quiet attention. A slightly different tone in his reports, a subtle independence in his opinions. To the paranoid mind of the KGB, that was enough. In May 1985, a terse cable arrived in the London residency. Comrade Gordievsky is to return to Moscow immediately for consultations. He knew instantly what that meant. For a KGB officer, a sudden recall was rarely good news. It could mean promotion or execution. MI6 offered to exfiltrate him immediately, but Oleg refused. He believed that fleeing now would confirm his guilt and doom other Western agents. He decided to go back, to face the lion's den and find a way to survive. When his plane touched down at Sheremetyevo Airport, Oleg felt the cold wind of Moscow like a blade on his skin. At the arrivals gate, KGB officers in plain clothes were waiting. No handcuffs, no words, just an escort to a black Volga car. They drove him through the gray streets to the Lubyanka headquarters, the same place where his father once worked, and where thousands of traitors had vanished without a trace. The interrogations began almost immediately. They didn't shout or strike him. They didn't need to. The KGB's method was psychological. Hours of silence. Simple questions asked again and again. Who are your contacts in London? What did you tell them? Why did you meet British officials so often? Oleg denied everything, calmly, repeatedly. He claimed the British admired his cultural work, that his meetings were diplomatic. He invoked party loyalty and quoted Lenin. Day after day, he maintained the same story. And eventually, perhaps out of overconfidence or lack of proof, the KGB released him, but placed him under strict surveillance. He was allowed to return to his Moscow apartment, where Layla and their 2 daughters lived. But the apartment was bugged. Cars followed him wherever he went. Even his friends avoided him. Fear was contagious in the Soviet Union. Oleg was now a prisoner in his own country. He knew he had only one chance left: to escape. Before his posting in London, MI6 had prepared an emergency exfiltration plan known only to a handful of officers. It was codenamed Operation Pimlico. If ever Oleg sent a specific signal, a prearranged code, British intelligence would mount a rescue through Soviet territory itself. The plan sounded impossible: to extract a hunted KGB officer from Moscow across hundreds of miles of surveillance to the Finnish border. Now, in 1985, it was time to try. One afternoon, Oleg walked to a small grocery near his apartment. Outside the shop, he placed a simple sign, a folded plastic bag over his right arm, exactly as MI6 had instructed years earlier. That was the trigger. Within hours, British intelligence officers in Moscow activated Operation Pimlico. The signal raced through London, Helsinki, and the British Embassy network. A rescue convoy was prepared, disguised as a family outing by Western diplomats. It would travel from Moscow to the Finnish frontier, carrying Oleg hidden in its back seat. Days later, on a quiet evening, Oleg slipped out of his apartment, walking casually toward a meeting point in a suburban park. There he met his MI6 contact, a British officer posing as a tourist. In a few hurried minutes, the plan was whispered. A car would leave Moscow in 2 days. He would be picked up near the outskirts, disguised under blankets in the rear compartment. The route would cross dozens of police checkpoints. If any officer stopped the car, the diplomats inside would claim immunity, a bluff that might or might not save them. It was the most audacious escape ever attempted during the Cold War. On the morning of the escape, the convoy, 2 vehicles with diplomatic plates, rolled out of Moscow under gray skies. Inside the rear seat of one car, between boxes of embassy supplies, lay Oleg Gordievsky. He had been sedated slightly to steady his nerves. A blanket covered him. A small air hole allowed him to breathe. Every few miles, the convoy slowed at checkpoints. Soviet guards peered into windows, stamping passports, waving them on. Each time the car passed, Oleg felt his heartbeat against the metal floor. Near the final checkpoint, the convoy was stopped longer than usual. A border guard walked slowly around the vehicles. He tapped the trunk. He asked to open the rear. The British driver, cool under pressure, smiled politely, invoking diplomatic immunity. After a pause that felt like eternity, the guard waved them through. The cars rolled forward. Behind them, the sign read, "You are now leaving the Soviet Union." At the border of Finland, Oleg Gordievsky emerged from his hiding place. For the first time in years, he breathed free air, the air of the West. He was pale, exhausted, trembling, but alive. The operation had succeeded. MI6 officers who met him in Helsinki could hardly believe it. They embraced him like a brother, knowing they had just pulled off one of the most daring escapes in modern espionage history. In Moscow, the KGB exploded in rage. They raided his apartment, interrogated his wife, and stripped him of rank and honors. Layla and their children were forbidden to leave the Soviet Union. For years, Oleg carried the guilt of having escaped alone. But he also knew his survival meant the preservation of countless Western lives. Through him, Britain and its allies had gained insight that prevented nuclear misunderstanding and perhaps war itself. In the West, Oleg Gordievsky became a symbol of moral courage, a man who risked everything not for wealth or glory, but for principle. He settled in Britain under protection, continuing to brief intelligence services for years. His defection dealt a devastating blow to the KGB, exposing operations and methods they never fully recovered from. And yet, he never forgot the price. The life he once knew, his home, his wife, his country, was gone forever. When Oleg Gordievsky crossed the border into Finland that night in 1985, the Cold War's invisible battlefield shifted forever. He had outwitted one of the most ruthless intelligence organizations on Earth and lived to tell the tale, something few spies could claim. But survival did not mean peace. In London, MI6 welcomed him not just as an agent, but as a man who had redefined the very idea of loyalty. They placed him in a safe house under heavy protection. For weeks he was debriefed around the clock. Every coded message, every meeting, every whisper from his KGB past was poured out, analyzed, and archived. Through Oleg's recollections, Western intelligence pieced together a portrait of the Soviet espionage machine with clarity that had never before been possible. He described how the KGB categorized its officers, how orders flowed from the Politburo, and how disinformation campaigns were crafted to manipulate Western societies. Perhaps most crucially, he revealed how dangerously the Kremlin misunderstood NATO's intentions. Moscow genuinely believed that the West was preparing for a surprise nuclear strike, a fear so deep it had once brought the world to the edge of annihilation. Oleg's intelligence showed that NATO's exercises, especially Able Archer 83, had been misread by Soviet generals as potential cover for a real attack. That revelation sent chills through every Western capital. The West had been seconds away from disaster, and they hadn't even known it. Gordievsky's reports became a turning point. They helped Western leaders, including Margaret Thatcher and later Ronald Reagan, understand the Soviet psyche, its paranoia, its fear, and its vulnerability. Prime Minister Thatcher met Oleg personally. She called him a man of remarkable courage. His information, she said, had helped avert catastrophe and guided her approach toward the Soviet Union, not just with strength, but with understanding. In those years, as the Cold War's chill began to thaw, Oleg watched from exile as the Soviet empire he once served began to crumble under its own weight. The Berlin Wall fell. Communist regimes collapsed. The KGB, once an omnipotent symbol of fear, fractured into confusion and reform. And in quiet moments, Oleg allowed himself to wonder whether his betrayal had, in some small way, helped open the door to change. Yet, behind the triumph, shadows lingered. Layla, his wife, and their daughters remained trapped in Moscow for years. The KGB interrogated them endlessly, their lives suffocated by suspicion and punishment. For Oleg, each day of freedom was laced with guilt. He sent letters through intermediaries, pleading with Western diplomats to negotiate their release. Finally, after tireless efforts, Layla and the children were allowed to join him in Britain. But the reunion, while joyful, was strained. Time and fear had built invisible walls between them. The family never fully healed. In later interviews, Oleg admitted that the price of his defection was not merely exile, but the fracture of everything he loved. In Moscow, the KGB marked him as a traitor of the highest order. In absentia, he was sentenced to death. Even after the Soviet Union's fall, Russian security services refused to rescind the verdict. For decades, Gordievsky lived under constant protection in Britain, his address secret, his movements quiet. Every stranger on the street, every unmarked car, could be a reminder that Moscow's reach was long. And then, in the 1990s, came rumors, a mysterious illness, an alleged poisoning attempt. One morning, he was found unconscious at home, his symptoms resembling those of nerve agents. British doctors saved him, but the message from the East was clear. Some betrayals are never forgiven. Yet Oleg never once regretted his decision. In interviews, his eyes remained calm, his voice precise and unwavering. "I had to choose between serving a lie," he said, "or serving the truth." To him, espionage had not been an act of betrayal, but of redemption, a rebellion against a system that had stolen the soul of his country. Historians now regard Oleg Gordievsky as one of the most valuable double agents in modern history. His intelligence reshaped Western strategy, his defection humiliated the KGB, and his courage inspired generations of spies who believed that truth was worth the ultimate risk. In 2018, when journalist Ben McIntyre published The Spy and The Traitor, the world finally glimpsed the full depth of Oleg's secret life, the quiet brilliance, the danger, and the loneliness. Readers discovered that espionage was not only about gadgets or codes, but about conscience, the eternal battle between duty and morality. As the decades passed, Oleg aged quietly in his adopted homeland. He lived in a modest house in southern England, surrounded by books and memories. He avoided publicity, granting only occasional interviews. When asked what he missed most about Russia, he paused for a long moment and said simply, "The language and the birch trees." That sentence captured the paradox of his life, a man who betrayed his nation to save it, who loved the very land that hunted him, and who carried the burden of truth until it became both his weapon and his wound. Today, his story stands as a monument to the complexity of the Cold War, a war fought not with armies, but with information, not for territory, but for ideology and survival. Through Oleg's eyes, we see the human cost of espionage, the loneliness, the fear, the moral ambiguity, and yet we also see courage, the kind that asks for no medals, no headlines, no glory. His life reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are performed in silence, in the shadows where history is written by men and women the world will never truly know. And so, as we close this story, remember the man who walked alone through two worlds, one ruled by secrecy, the other by freedom. Oleg Gordievsky, the spy who became a traitor to tyranny and a savior to peace. His defection did not end the Cold War, but it reminded both East and West that understanding, not domination, was the only way forward. Even now, long after the fall of the Iron Curtain, his message echoes quietly across generations. "Truth," he once said, "is the most dangerous weapon of all." You've been listening to The Spy and the Traitor, the greatest espionage story of the Cold War. Written and narrated in documentary form for those who seek to understand not just history, but the fragile humanity behind it. Thank you for listening. And remember, in every war of secrets, there are still men and women who choose truth over fear.